Night of the Kettle Dance. That night the brigade camped at the head of the Long Sioux. Though Pierre was glad to have those tough portages behind him, he was nervous when Charbonneau bragged about how far they would paddle the next day. Tomorrow we hit a sweet stretch of river, not a single shoal or rapids to slow us down. We cover 40 miles easy. That meant steady paddling with his blistered hands. As they carried the packs to the campsite, Pierre asked Emile, "Can we really paddle that far in one day?" "Charbonneau starts fast," Emile said with a smile, tugging at his curly sideburns. "And once we hit the big water, he'll go even faster." He looked at Pierre's hands. "How are they holding up?" Pierre shrugged. He didn't want to admit that his fingers were too sore to straighten. While the light was still strong, Pierre helped Emile gum the canoe and fix the watap and the cedar root lacing on the canoe seams that had frayed during their upstream drags. Every canoe carried spare watt tape and pine gum, as well as rolled sheets of birch bark for repairing leaks and tears. Later, Pierre wandered down to the shore and looked north. Above the horizon rose the forbidding, glacier-scored hills of the Canadian Shield. "So what do you think of her?" Lalonde asked. He relaxed on a nearby log. "It looks like tough country." "Tough and wild," Lalonde agreed. "That ridge will lie to the north for our whole trip to Grand Portage." Pierre nodded. His father had told him of the famous outcroppings known as the Laurentian Hills. They marked the point where the river started flowing north to the Hudson Bay. When the first explorers came searching for a trade route to China, that highland crushed their hopes, but to us it's home. "Home?" Pierre questioned, staring at the cold hills. Lalonde laughed at Pierre's frown. "I remember the first night I camped here. I was scared stiff. A 14-year-old short hair away from home for the very first time. I sat down that ledge right over there and bawled my eyes out." Pierre frowned. He wondered if Lalonde was making up a story to make him feel good. "It's true," Lalonde insisted, seeing the doubt in Pierre's eyes. "That spring my old man booted me out of the house. One day he said, 'Time you got out and made something of yourself.' Next thing you know, my papers were signed and I was paddling north." "Your father never asked if you wanted to sign on?" "No," Lalonde laughed at Pierre's astonishment. "He was a storekeeper, and 9 kids were too many to feed. So out I went." "Just like that?" "There's no need to feel sorry for me," he said, patting Pierre gently on the shoulder. "I headed north that year, and I never did go back. In a season, I fell in love with this life. Wouldn't trade it for anything now. Besides," Lalonde smiled as he stood and waved a hand in the direction of the men who were clustered around the campfire, "who could ever ask for a nicer family than those fellows?" Alone, Pierre watched the sun disappear in pink-purple trails. Cold crept down from the darkening hills, and steam rose off the water. A blackbird called upriver. Pierre thought of his mother back home in Lachine. She would be warming a pot of tea on the wood stove right about now. From the time he was a little boy, he'd taken a cup of tea with his parents before he went to bed. When he was small, the tea was mostly milk, but it made him feel like a grown-up. Later there was a book or a story before they tucked him in for the night. When Pierre walked back to camp, he found Bellegarde at the fire preparing that evening's feast. The big cooking pot, filled with water, pork fat, and corn, was propped between 2 flat rocks and just beginning to steam. The air was heavy with smoke. Bellegarde knelt, whistling and making work of the duck. He tossed feathers in all directions. Pierre smiled when he imagined what his mother would think of the cook's crude technique. It was hard for Pierre not to stare at the cook's scarred face. Bellegarde was a thin man with greasy hair and small, close-set eyes. He was the oldest man in the brigade, and according to La Petite, the most experienced, having traveled down the Fraser River to Canada's western coast. His work as a cook was a step toward retirement. "Is it true," Pierre had asked, "that you've canoed the Athabasca?" "It is," Bellegarde replied, never taking his eyes off the duck. "And true that I paddled all the way to the Pacific. And true that I spent many a winter with nothing but a trading gun to bring down my supper." "You wintered that far west?" "I've traveled twice to New Caledonia, and I've married 8 good wives too. I surely haven't wasted my whole life with pork eaters such as these, he said, jerking his head and spitting into the fire. Men who went no farther north than Grand Portage were sometimes called pork eaters, out of scorn. I've seen sights that turn your blood cold, he stated, as he laid the duck across a log and sawed off its head and feet with his hunting knife. Next, Bellegarde crouched before the fire and passed the bird back and forth through the flames a few times to singe off the pin feathers. Then, in a loud voice, loud enough for half the camp to hear, he announced, "Now to flavor our soup." To Pierre's horror, Bellegarde tossed the blackened carcass, entrails and all, into the cooking pot. Pierre coughed, and the cook turned with a grin. "What's this, young man? Is my butchering not fancy enough for you?" "So, Bellegarde," Charbonneau interrupted from the side of the fire, "which one of your wives taught you such a recipe for duck? I bet she was old and blind." A chorus of laughs rose out around the fire. "She was lots prettier than you fellows," Bellegarde scoffed, "and she could see plenty good." Pierre stared at Bellegarde, wondering what else he'd planned to throw into his kettle. Jean Beloy, who was sitting on a flat rock, teased Pierre, "You never want to waste the guts, boy. That's the tastiest part." Beloy saw Pierre grimace, so he pushed it one step further. "Just ask the Sioux. Those fellows love the innards. After a buffalo kill, they might fight for the first bite of raw liver. Same with the intestines. I've seen braves chew their way through a gut pile like kids at a taffy pull." Wide-eyed, he raked his hands through an imaginary mouth of entrails. "There's hundreds of feet," he continued, "and it stretches so far that a man can start at either end, and—" When Pierre jumped up, Beloy feigned surprise. "What's wrong?" As Pierre knelt behind a big balsam tree and emptied his stomach, he could hear Beloy bragging, "I think something make Grandpa a little sick." Pierre hated that stupid crackling voice. He heard Lalonde stick up for him. "What'd you do to the poor boy? Let him look at you? That'd make anybody sick." Pierre felt ashamed. As bad as the nickname Grandpa was, poor boy was even worse. Later, when the men gathered around the kettle to fill their plates, Pierre walked back to the fire. McKay took his place at the head of the line, and the other crew members fell in behind him. Though Pierre didn't feel like eating, he knew he could never endure 40 miles of upstream paddling tomorrow without food. It was a mystery to him how these men could work so hard, living on only 2 meals and pipe smoke. He took a place near the end of the line, trying to draw as little attention to himself as possible. When his turn finally came, Bellegarde ladled a big pile of soupy corn onto his plate. Just when it looked as if Pierre would be left to eat in peace, Beloy crowed, "I see why they call this one Grandpa. He's wiser than his years. How many young fellows be smart enough to know the best comes last? It's a clever fellow who waits until the pot is almost empty and the duck parts are settled to the bottom." Pierre just smiled and set down his food without looking at it. "Here," he said to Bellegarde, "let me help. It's not fair that the cook always has to eat last." Astonished by such unexpected consideration, Bellegarde accepted Pierre's offer. As Pierre loaded up Bellegarde's plate, the proud cook turned toward the fire, declaring to anyone who would listen, "Finally, we have a man among us who knows how to treat Andre." Pierre served the rest of the men. When it was Beloy's turn, he pointed to the boy's ladle. "Look," he said, "our little lady friend has found a tool he can handle." Pierre's ears burned, but he said nothing. Beloy laughed his way to his seat on a rock next to Lalonde and began eating. Pierre watched Beloy as he served the last men. It took him longer to eat than the others because he talked the whole time. Bits of food fell into his lap or got caught in his beard, but he didn't care. Just when Pierre was convinced that Beloy would never finish his meal, the man took a big scoop from his borrowed plate, saying, "This is what I call corn soup. Tastes like poetry, it does." "Look who's talking," Charbonneau said. "You wouldn't know a poem from a pack-sack." Beloy shoveled the heaping spoonful in and bit down hard, but suddenly he was spitting the food out on the ground. "Ugh!" he growled, hacking and spitting a second time. "What's the matter?" Lalonde asked. "Can't you stomach that elegant meat?" The rest of the crew turned to see what had caused the commotion. Beloy searched the ground frantically. A moment later he paused and slowly held up the bright orange foot of a duck. "Who's had his hands in the cooking pot?" Several men grinned, but no one said anything. "I'll have his ears, I will," Beloy said. As he spoke, he fingered the hilt of the knife that hung in his waist. Pierre could no longer contain himself and burst into a peal of laughter. Beloy rubbed his eyes and squinted. "You?" The whole company joined in Pierre's laughter. Lalone, his white hair shaking, clapped Beloy on the shoulder, saying, "That's one on you, Ivernot." Beloy glared across the fire, still touching the bone handle of his knife. Pierre imagined what his ears would look like floating in the cooking pot. "What's the matter, Jean?" Charbonneau called. "I've heard the Sioux regard duck's feet as a rare delicacy." That was enough to bring half a smile to Beloy's face. As he grinned, he tossed the webbed foot towards Pierre. He's saying, "You such a good cook's helper, I share it with you." "Thank you, sir," Pierre said in mock politeness as the foot rolled to the edge of the fire. "But I've had my fill." When Beloy laughed again, Pierre knew he was safe, but his heart was racing as if he'd run a long way. What would have he done if the evil man had unsheathed his knife? He finally sat down to eat. The corn and the duck and salt pork were delicious, sweetened by his revenge. Pierre was ready for bed. He needed to rest if he wanted to survive the next day's paddling with his aching arms and blistering hands. But just as Pierre was reaching for his blanket, La Petite shouted, "It's time for the kettle dance!" And there was great commotion throughout the camp. Without another word, kegs were opened and 2 sacks were placed beside the fire. La Petite, as the senior member of the brigade, stood on one sack, while Emile Duval stood on the other. Each held a kettle under his arm. Pierre watched as Emile, dressed in deerskin leggings, a long shirt, a sash, and a feathered cap, began prancing in a half circle and singing, "We leave good hearts our loves behind, for parting to span 3 seasons. But voyagers born, we journey to live, and spit in the face of danger." Duval paused then, and the rest of the crew took up the rousing chorus. "We start the bold traverse today, away, brave friends, away. For the safety of our company pray, away, brave friends, away." La Petite stepped forward, dressed in a blue cloak and a red sash. Carrying a beaded bag, he moved about slowly and sang in a big, sweet voice, "Dark will our nights be, and cold our couches. The devil by lay will seize our blades. Over portages long, and Sioux and streams, with death-stalked hearts we sing." The crew joined in as before, and the singers went on, taking turns for the next 7 verses. The men laughed and clapped, and at the end of each verse, at least one man shrieked. Pierre, trying to shake his sleep from his eyes, studied the cavorting men and thought back over the hard upstream haul they had made that day. Where does all their energy come from? He wondered, admiring Lalone's high kicking style. When Pierre was too tired to watch any longer, he rolled out his blanket under a canoe. The voices soon faded as he fell into a sleep, dreamless sleep. And that's the end of the camp. Without another word, kegs were opened and 2 sacks were placed beside the fire.
Kent, wheel it to the main office to leave for the day. Kent, wheel it to the main office to leave for the day.